Hiya! Okay, so this is the final section of transport across the cell membrane, which you will be glad to hear. And it is all about active transport. So again, by the end of this little section, you should understand why I've put this GIF up there, because it is just the most perfect metaphor for active transport. It's not talking about trains, sorry if you get confused by that. There's nothing to do with trains in what we're about to talk about. It's more about what the people are doing.
Okay, so in this we're going to learn about what active transport is and how it is different from passive transport. And this image here, as daft as it may seem, it pretty accurately describes the whole thing. So diffusion and osmosis, they're a passive transport. That's basically like riding your bike down a hill. It requires absolutely no energy. You just start and then you just keep rolling and rolling and rolling, and you don't need to put any kind of energy or effort into it because you're going down a hill.
And you're going from a higher to a lower place.
Yep. Whereas active transport is like going up a hill. So starting at the bottom and going to the top, you require a lot of energy. You're going to get really tired really quickly, and it is going to require you to put in a lot of energy and effort. And that is pretty much what active transport is. The difference between passive and active. Passive requires no energy. Active, it kind of does what it says in the tin. It requires energy. You're being active, you're doing things, so it is energy required. Okay, so by the end of this, you should be able to state the main difference between passive and active, which I've pretty much just explained to you. You should be able to define active transport, state which part of the cell membrane allows active transport to occur, and predict the movement of molecules during active transport based on a given concentration gradient.
Now that's the key skill at the bottom there. Just like with diffusion and osmosis, where you had to predict where the molecules will move, which is why you cannot allow yourself to get tricked by exam questions. Make sure you know what type of transport they are asking you to predict the molecule movement. So if they're saying diffusion, it's going higher to lower. Osmosis, higher water to lower water. For active transport, something a bit different, but you need to be able to predict, okay, the molecules are going to move from this area to this area because I know the rules of active transport. So as a reminder, this is just a little map to show sort of the different types of transport and how they feature, just in case you got confused up until now. So substances have to cross the membrane so you can get things that the cell needs and get rid of things that you don't need. There's two main types of membrane transport. So there's active and there's passive, and then two types of passive transport are osmosis and diffusion. Okay, so that's just mapping it out there so you've got a bit of a clearer picture of how these are all related to each other.
There are no examples of active transport you need to know. You just need to know active transport is a thing. Some things you read might talk about the sodium potassium pump as an example. It is a good example, but the problem is a couple of years ago they had an exam question in which they actually did it the opposite way around.
Yeah.
They wanted you to read it and actually see what was happening, and people saw it and went, oh, sodium, potassium, I know what happens, I know what things move. And actually the question was the opposite way around. And the idea is you need to read it and see what is happening. So no examples of active transport. If you see the sodium potassium pump, brilliant, it's a thing.
Don't memorize it.
Don't learn it. It's not worth it because it's not in the course. It's not needed. So they very well might throw in a twist again. So don't learn it.
All they're looking for you to do is spot the higher and lower concentrations and then figure out the movement pattern. And it'll be the same for active as it is for passive, but passive is following slightly different rules from active.
So active transport, again, final important definition in this, which you are learning, again, letter for letter. So active transport is the movement of molecules from a lower concentration to a higher concentration against a concentration gradient, and it requires energy, which is in the form of ATP. Really big definition, lots of crucial parts to it. You have to know it and you have to be able to say that word for word. It's a flashcard one, it is one you will memorize word for word. Lots of points to it. Lower to higher, against a concentration gradient, and requires energy. 3 key points to this definition here.
Now let's look at how those molecules are actually moving. They're moving like the complete opposite of osmosis and diffusion. Instead of going from a busy area to a quiet area, they're going from a quiet area into an even busier area. Okay, so they don't like their personal space. They are clingy and they are completely and utterly ignoring any kind of normal social boundaries. Think of it again like that train that we had at the start. Okay, all those people on a nice spacious platform, all the space in the world, cramming into that train, needing people to shove them in because there's so many of them, all of that energy needing expended to get those people packed into that tiny space. Similar thing that's happening here. Loads of energy needs used and the protein is helping shove these molecules into the more crowded space.
Okay, so like we've just said, this transport requires energy, and that energy source is this molecule called ATP. Now, this is something we'll actually touch on much more when we talk about respiration in particular, but for just now, you just need to know ATP is an energy molecule. If we are talking about energy in biology, we are talking about ATP at this stage. So ATP is the energy we are talking about, and try to refer to it as that ATP.
Yeah, for this process, just saying that active transport requires energy, you're good, as long as you remember that also osmosis and diffusion do not require energy. Okay, so that's a key point there. Now, I mentioned this before, the proteins. Now, this is a key point that you do need to be able to talk about. I've seen it in one exam question so far. During active transport, proteins in the cell membrane use energy to transport molecules against the concentration gradient. So think of the proteins are like those platform station pushers. Okay, they are the things that are using the energy in order to shove things from a nice quiet area into a more busy area. So here in our membrane, we've got our protein molecules, because if it's not a phospholipid, it's going to be a protein, okay? And they are going to transport using energy against the concentration gradient, so up that slope from a lower place to a higher place. And this is why that person on the bicycle, that image at the start, is actually a really handy thing, because you think diffusion or osmosis is going from a higher place to a lower place using no energy, just freewheeling, whereas active transport going from a lower to higher using energy, so going against that concentration gradient, up it, and using lots of energy.
Okay, so again, practice questions similar to one you might get in your exam, maybe a slightly easier one that you would get in your exam. But it's asking you to draw an arrow to show the movement of potassium. And there was a question like this, like 2 years ago.
Last year. It was really easy,
in
actually.
2019. Literally just drawing an arrow was the first part of it. So looking at this, outside the cell, 17% potassium concentration. Inside the cell, 23% potassium concentration. You need to remember active transport, it's going from lower to higher, so the arrow is going to go from outside into the cell, and you would just have to draw an arrow. Easy. It appeared once, I wouldn't hope that it would appear again. It was easy.
I don't know.
Or there might be more to it.
They kind of like these predict the movement of molecule questions. Okay, now you don't memorize this, okay? So again, we say do not memorize examples of active transport, because probably in this year's exam paper there'd be something like a iodine question and it's following the rules of diffusion. But in real life, okay, an example of how active transport's actually handy is seaweed needs quite a high concentration of iodine inside of it in order to live. It's like a vitamin, an essential vitamin for seaweed. There's a very low concentration of iodine in seawater and a much higher concentration in seaweed. Now, if this followed the rules of diffusion, the seaweed would constantly leak iodine, which would be bad for it. But it doesn't. It follows the rules of active transport. So the seaweed uses energy in order to collect the iodine from the lower concentration into the higher concentration in its tissues. And that means they can get a higher concentration inside their own tissues, meaning that they get to survive and live. The iodine that you use in chemistry departments, that sort of thing, it was originally extracted from seaweed until we learned how to, I think, chemically synthesize it now. Oh, it is an element. I don't know how they chemically synthesize an element. But yeah, is that they used to collect it out of seaweed.
Okay, so that is pretty much the end of this whole key area. That's now been, what, 5 videos?
Yep.
Yeah, lots of videos on this key area. So for this final one, active transport, there wasn't as much on it as the two types of passive. You have to state the main difference between passive and active, which you can't. It's the fact that it requires energy and passive doesn't. Your definition of active transport, that big paragraph almost that I told you about, you need to be able to state which part of the cell membrane allows active transport to occur, so that's talking about your proteins, and to be able to predict the movement of molecules during active transport, so saying it is going from the lower to the higher, and identifying where actually that is in a diagram or a description.
Okay, so again, lots of past paper questions on this whole key area. Really advise that you get onto the SQA website or have a look at the past paper packs from us and give them a go, making sure that you mark yourself according to the SQA mark scheme. Don't be easy on yourself. There are some tough marks awarded there. It's worth being accurate now so that you can be accurate in the exam.
And it is a hard key area. It's probably one of the hardest ones.
Yeah.
So don't stress too much if you don't get it straight away.
Definitely going to be asked about though.
Yeah.
Yay.
It's definitely going to be asked about. So if you don't get it straight away, that's okay. But take the time to learn it.
Yep. Okay, so the next key area, DNA and proteins, will follow next.
Yep.